Rahul by Asta Group. Transcript. Hey guys, how are you all? Welcome back to my channel. Today we will see what if Naruto used shadow clones to get rich. If you enjoy, then please like, share and do comments. Annoyed with how often the teachers were throwing him out of class, Naruto muttered, "Fine, if you don't want to teach me then I'll have to learn this stuff on my own, and if you don't want to teach me techniques then I'll come up with my own." Sneaking into the store hadn't been difficult because it was owned and run by a civilian who was too cheap to hire someone to help secure it from people breaking in. There were a large number of people in the village who could just get around any traps that he put up anyway. Even with his sneaking into the store, Naruto wasn't truly a thief because he planned to pay for all the books and things that he took. Looking in the book section, Naruto knew that even though the scrolls for several common lower-level techniques were on sale in the store, that they were only able to be purchased by registered shinobi, and that if he took a copy of them then he would get into major trouble even if he did pay for them. Sticking to the section of shinobi books that were available to civilians, Naruto packed up a whole set of the books that were required for the first year of the academy, as well as several of the books that were on their optional list. Running through the shinobi section, Naruto grabbed several of the scrolls that he knew shouldn't get him in trouble, such as the scroll that went more in depth on how each of the hand seals works and how to use each one most efficiently in the jutsu that were generally available. A scroll of chakra control exercises and a basic camping jutsu scroll joined his stack from the registered shinobi section as well. Pulling out his toad-shaped wallet, he got out the required amount of money for the books that he took and placed it into the register. His wallet was much flatter than when he entered the store, but that was to be expected with him spending almost 2/3 of his savings on the books and scrolls. Bore wasn't one to normally observe Naruto, so earlier it had been a surprise to him to see Naruto sneaking into one of the civilian-run shinobi supply stores. Ever since the Yu clan had been destroyed by Itachi, Yu had taken up most of the former duties that had been vacated so abruptly. With all of the deaths currently, they were taking up almost 3/4 of what the UI military police once took care of, while they helped build a new police force that would at least take care of civilian-level crime. As he watched Naruto build up a number of books and scrolls on the counter, he was somewhat surprised that most of them came from the sections that anyone could purchase from. He did see Naruto going through the section that would normally be off limits to anyone but a registered shishinoi, but considering that the scrolls that he came out with weren't dangerous and mostly just contained exercises or jutsu that weren't taught at the academy anymore, he decided to just let it pass for now. Seeing Naruto actually pay the correct amount for the books and scrolls was another shock for Bore, but he just shrugged and thought about how he had seen the blonde being thrown out of several stores before. As long as he was paying for it, then there wasn't really any reason to report it. As he watched Naruto sneak out of the store, he pulled out the paperwork that the shopkeeper was supposed to fill out whenever books like the blonde had bought. Quickly filling in the required fields, he took a moment to think about the shinobi ID number before grinning under his mask and putting in the number for a Janine that he knew had died on a mission several days ago, along with changing the date on the paperwork to reflect that the scrolls had been bought several days before the start of the disastrous mission. Getting back to his rounds, he wondered just what Naruto was going to do with the materials that he had just bought, not knowing that he had been watched almost the entire time he had been in the store. He made his way back to his apartment to look over his new books and scrolls. Starting on the books that he had already had, he noticed that his new copies were not only in better condition than the ones that he had bought before, but that the newer ones were larger than the ones that he had gotten when he entered the academy. He had always wondered why his books looked different than the other students in his class, but then again he just tried to ignore it before as well. Comparing the books, he was shocked to find that most of the material that he had been stunned about on the last test was in the new book that he had gotten when his old one didn't even speak of it. Looking closer at the older book, he noticed that it had a number of pages pulled out in such a way that unless you knew that they were missing, you would never notice the missing pages. Growling to himself, he looked over all of his other books and found that they all had the problem, and that if it was possible, the most important pages in the text were missing. On his old books settling in for the weekend, he decided to read the newer copies of the books to find out about what he had been missing. By the time that Monday had rolled around, Naruto had read all of the books that were required for the first year of the academy and finally understood the lectures that he had actually been allowed to sit through without being tossed out. Ever since he had started the academy, it had been frustrating with how much it seemed like he couldn't learn that everyone else seemed to think was so easy. Now it all made sense, and the Sensei at the academy had to be in on it for him to have missed so many important parts of the lessons. Thinking back to his promise from when he had been thrown out of class, he pulled all of the books and scrolls that he had that contained techniques in them, and after counting was disappointed that he only had about 30 techniques to start from, with most being E-rank techniques. Deciding to skip class for the day, he pulled out the hand signs and how they react in Jutsu book and start figuring out how all of the hand signs made up the 30 techniques that he had. The next day he had worked out how the academy's 3 main techniques worked with the hand seals that they were used with, and while he couldn't perform any of them yet, they weren't taught for several years anyway, so for now he was good on that. During the times that he had taken breaks from breaking down the Jutsu, he thought about his plans and decided that he wouldn't show any new techniques that he developed to anyone. If he could help it, returning to the academy really cut down on his time to create his new techniques, but there were many areas of being a shinobi that he just didn't know about, that weren't even mentioned in the books that were mentioned in the lectures that he had already been present for. He was going to hide his techniques and surprise everyone when he used them. He was lucky that day, as it was the one day a month that the whole academy turned out for, as they had a Jonin come in and show off one of their more flashy techniques. Welcome students, the Jan in charge of the academy said as he gestured with his one good arm in welcome today. As those of you who have been here more than 1 year know, we have one of the Jan, and with some downtime come in and show you all one of the techniques that you may learn in the future. Today we have been given the rare honor of Jan and Kakashi Hitaki being in the village, and he has it to show off a technique that he recently learned for our benefit. With that, the JN and in charge of the academy left the small stage, and another man took his place dressed in the standard JN uniform and with his headband tilted to cover one of his eyes. Normally I try and stay away from this because I don't think that I should show off most of the techniques that I know, but for today someone that I know convinced me that this technique at the very least should be okay, Kakashi said as he left the stage and moved towards several large containers that had been placed on the acad grounds just for this purpose, quickly performing the 28 hand signs for the technique. Kakashi called out water style water dragon jutsu. A large dragon made of water rose from the water in the containers and was sent flying toward the small wooded area of the academy training areas. Normally the students wouldn't have been able to see Kakashi's hand seals, however, as he had just recently learned the technique and he was still quite slow when using it, as he wasn't actively copying the motions from someone else. Naruto, who had been watching almost in awe as the Janin showed off the technique, and as he could see all of the hand signs that Kakashi had used for the technique, he memorized them so that maybe he could learn the technique later. Ah well, that was invigorating now, wasn't it, Kakashi said as he finished the technique and bowed to the class before disappearing in a whirl of leaves without a hand sign. Now I know that Kakashi has already left, but if you would, could you give him a round of applause for that wonderful demonstration, the headmaster of the academy said as he retook the stage. There was a thunderous sound as all of the students started clapping, while every one of them had visions of them using the technique in the future. When Naruto got home that night to his apartment that night, he wrote down every that he had seen about the water style water dragon jutsu and started breaking it down the same way that he had the main academy 3, and after 3 hours of work he had the technique broken down, but the results weren't what he had thought that they would be, unless he was missing something. The technique shouldn't have worked at all because there wasn't anything to tie it to the water that he had used in the technique. Deciding that maybe there were things that he didn't know about the jutsu yet, he set to work breaking down some more of the techniques that he had, so that when the time came he would be able to pull them off easier. And yet again there seemed to be things that didn't make sense in the techniques. The following 2 weeks until the end of the semester were almost the same as the sensei of the various classes started getting the students ready for their first 2-month break between classes. This had been implemented by the council after the second grade shinobi war so that the clans could give their younger members who were in the academy special training in their clan techniques. The break also gave the students without clans with a 2-month break to train in whatever they wanted. Students who weren't in clans could also add their name to a list that would be posted up for active Chunin and Jan to choose if they wished to personally teach any of the students for their break, unless the ninja in question liked the academy student for whatever reason, or if they were very skilled in the same areas as the ninja. Most of the time the student would not receive any training, turning in his application with the rest of the students. Naruto left the classroom to get started on the various exercises that they had been assigned for the break. Just before he left the building he thought of a question to ask the teacher and turned to head back to The classroom which he found empty. Turning to leave again, he saw a crumpled piece of paper. Taking the paper and flattening it, he was shocked to find out that it was his application for further training over the break. Walking home, sort of dejected from the way his teacher had acted toward him, he decided to start researching into the jutsu that he knew further over the break, as well as getting the next 2 years' worth of books that he would need for the academy. And learning their material in advance, he hoped that since he was getting up to the 3rd year texts that he could find out how to do the techniques, as well as what it was that he was missing about the water dragon that he had seen. Sneaking back into the same store as last time, he quickly gathered the books for the next 2 years at the academy, which thankfully weren't in nearly as great a supply as the books for the first year were, because several of the books for the first year would be reused for the further years at the academy. Going back to the registered shobi section, he searched the titles for any that would explain just why he couldn't break down some of the techniques, while others he could understand easily. He wasn't having very much luck until he came across a scroll that was entitled The Elements of Chakra and How They Affect Hand Seals, which seemed to be an addition to the book that he had found earlier. Searching more deeply, he found a scroll hidden at the back of a shelf that was titled Technique Types and How They're Different from One Another. Again, searching the area, he found a large book entitled Famous Techniques from Around the Shinobi Nations and How to Know Them. When you see them taking these 3 scrolls back up to the front of the store, he started figuring out what all of the books would cost him when he noticed that the second scroll that he had found wasn't listed on the price sheet that he had, and that it wasn't listed as being available in the shop at all. Paying for the books that he could find the price, he debated with himself for a while before he took the scroll that he couldn't find the price for with him as well, which wiped his savings down to almost nothing other than the supplies that he got from the academy. And the supplies that he could make on his own. He wouldn't be able to buy a NYM for a while, but luckily tomorrow was the day that he got his monthly Stien. Cat saw Nar entering the store and, curious as to what Nar was going to do, and followed. Seeing Nar gathering the books for the next 2 years at the academy, he was getting ready to show himself and arrest Naruto for stealing, but wanted to wait until he actually had proof that he was stealing, so he waited. Seeing the 4 items from the shinobi section, he wondered just what Naruto wanted with them, as he saw Naruto pull out his toad wallet and pay the correct amount for all the scrolls and books except for one from the shobi section. He relaxed because he had seen Naruto be thrown out of other stores before, and obviously it wasn't that he wasn't going to pay, he was getting the books for the correct price. And now that he thought about it, he remembered the last scroll was one that normally wasn't available in civilian shops, and that about 2 years ago a number of scrolls bound for one of the shinobi shops had been misdirected to this shop, and that supposedly the merchant who ran the shop had run out of them. Shortly after thinking back, he remembered that Naruto had found the scroll hidden in the shelf out of sight. Most likely the merchant didn't even know that the scroll was even there, and Naruto had made a lucky find, deciding that as long as Naruto had paid, it wasn't theft. Cat left as soon as Naruto did and decided not to report it, because while it wasn't looked well upon, Naruto had paid the correct amount for the things that he had taken, so there wasn't any harm in it. After much thought and planning that night, he decided that he would try and use what he had learned for at least several days by camping out on Training Ground 34, which was the academy's assigned training field because it was right behind the academy. Training Ground 34 was well known because civilians and academy students both used it, as well as foreign teams. When the Leaf Village played host for the Tunin exams during the academy break, it was normally uninhabited except for the areas around the edge and occasionally the several areas in it that held training equipment. As the 3rd largest training field in the Leaf Village, it was mainly used by the academy for their physical exercises and for their survival training exercises. Packing up the things that he thought that he would need for the camping that he was going to do, he put them in the bag that he normally used for the academy and left to find a good spot to camp for several days. Finding a small clearing in the forest, he started to set up a small camp like they had been taught in the academy, and finding that he would need more supplies than what he had running back to the academy, Naruto quickly entered the shed in the back where they stored most of the equipment for the survival exercises and grabbed a tent, cooking tools, several cantons, and one of the basic trap sets. Never realizing that, like all of his previous entries, this one had been seen, he ran back to where he was setting up camp and finished setting up. Asuma Sarut Toy was fresh back from the capital and freshly promoted to Jonin, and he was looking through the files of the next graduating class to see if there were any he would like to try and take as a team. Finding none, he was exiting the academy. He saw Naruto running off with the items that he had taken from the shed. As he had nothing better to do currently, he followed and watched as Naruto set up a small basic camp complete with small traps and snares to catch game. Watching for a little while, he saw Naruto gathering as many of the fruits and plants that were edible in the area as he could, because Asuma knew that it was the start of break for the academy. He wasn't too worried but decided to tell his father where Naruto was before he could start worrying. Forming the ram hand seal, he disappeared in a swirl of leaves, reappearing in another swirl of leaves. Asuma stood in front of the cage tower. Walking up the stairs, he waved to the receptionist, who waved him through. Opening the office door, he saw his father working on the paperwork again and waited for him to finish with the document that he was working on. Asuma, what brings you here this morning? Here is in, said as he finally looked up from the paperwork. Did you find any prospects in the next graduating class? No, pops, Asuma said as he took the chair directly across from his father, but I did see something interesting as I was leaving the academy that you would probably want to know about. Oh, and what would I find interesting here? Aizen asked his son as he folded his hands back into the sleeves of his robes. Naruto taking some camping equipment from the storage shed behind the academy, Asuma said as he pulled out a cigarette and lit it with an almost neglect wave of his hand, activating a small fire technique. I also followed him back to his small campsite. He set up the camp correctly and then started gathering food from the area, so he may be planning to stay there for a while. Thoughts began to fly around in Hen's head at an alarming rate as he quickly pulled out his crystal ball and said, show me where Naruto is camping, giving directions to where Naruto was in the training ground. Asuma watched as the crystal ball lit up from within and slowly moved about until it zoomed in on the small clearing that Naruto was staying in. Idly the thought that no matter how many times he had seen it in action, his father's crystal ball technique would always interest him, because while at one point in time his father had tried to teach him how to perform it, he had never been able to pull it off. Zooming in on the small clearing, they saw that Naruto had gathered some wood and dug a small fire pit that had an amount of wood already set up in it, ready to be lit. Across the clearing from his tent, Naruto had wrapped up the trunk of a tree and rope to use as a punching post and was currently setting up traps in the nearby river to catch fish. Sighing here, Aizen turned his gaze to his son and asked, what do you think that he is doing there? With the way that most of the village treats him, he may just want to get away from it for a while, Asuma said as he took the dead cigarette from his lips and pulled a fresh one from the pack in his pocket. With the way that he set up his camp, one think that he just wants to train for most of the break, so it might be best to just have one of your who check up on him once every couple of days till he comes back to the village proper, because he has the first 3 years of the academy's books with him in that tent. It took Naruto the first 3 days of camping to figure out where he had been going wrong with his attempts at jutsu. In one of the third-year books, it mentioned an exercise that consisted of moving chakra along the chakra network, and as it was referring back, Naruto assumed that it was referring to an exercise that they were meant to learn in the second year at the academy, because he knew for a fact that it hadn't been taught in class last so far. After a while of searching, he found the exercise and how it was supposed to work. To use jutsu, a ninja runs chakra around the body's chakra network, and with the use of hand seals forms patterns from the chakra in its chakra network, also known as chakra coils. The more a ninja uses jutsu, the more that they adapt their body to the JSU that they perform. Most higher tier jutsu require much greater chakra releases than young ninjas' bodies can handle, because along the chakra network are 10 ketsu or chakra points where chakra is released from the body, and as the ninja gradually works on bigger and bigger techniques, these points are gradually made wider and wider, allowing for larger and larger techniques. The same could be said for reserves, because by constantly using chakra and allowing the reserves to refill, a ninja will be increasing the amount of chakra available to them. However, there is a risk to this, because at any given time the body only has a set limit to the amount of chakra that it has, even if this amount is constantly increasing. Due to training using too much chakra can have many negative impacts on the body and can lead to the ninja destroying their own body if they trained too hard or used too much chakra running through the exercise. He found that it was much easier than the books said it would be, and that by the end of his first time doing it, that he could already use the camping fire technique. The technique was designed to use minimal chakra because of sensors that could be searching for the user in his books that were for the third year of the academy. Naruto had found out how to reduce the smoke from his fire, as well as a number of wild plants that could be used to flavor his other food. After that first fire technique, he couldn't get any of his other techniques to work, not even another of the one that he had gotten to work several minutes into this Naruto. Slapped his head as an idea occurred to him from what he had previously read, the exercise that had allowed him to perform. The technique had written as part of the directions that it may take several iterations over several days to get the technique correct, and that while some of them may seem to work, the exercise was in fact forcing the body to activate the chakra network, and that some bodies were more resistant to this than others. In other words, some people would have an easy time activating the chakra network and others would have a harder time. How hard it was to activate heat chakra coils was completely dependent on the size of the reserve, because the larger the reserve of chakra, the harder it was to activate. 2 days of trying the exercise allowed him to hit what the scroll had said was a halfway point in activating his chakra coils, and after that he could perform most of the camping techniques, although apparently he massively overcharged the lightning one that was supposed to give light for reading. When he had done the technique, there had been a huge flash of light and he had nearly blinded himself with it. It had taken nearly a whole week after that event that he was able to complete the exercise as it had been intended, with his whole chakra network active and able to be used. Learning all 30 of the academy level techniques didn't take very long after that, although he still did have trouble with about 4 of them. henge clones and the 2 minor gen jutsu that they taught in the academy were techniques that he just couldn't perform. Rereading through the techniques in their descriptions, he was surprised to find that the answer had been staring him in the face all afternoon. It had taken him a week and a half to complete the exercise that would allow him to use chakra normally, while the book had said that normally the exercise would be completed in 3 or 4 days at a maximum. That pointed to a very large chakra reserves, and one of the other books had said that the larger the reserve, the harder it would be to control the smaller jutsu, as well as almost all gen jutsu, because they needed more control than power. With that problem solved, he pulled out the scroll that detailed the different chakra control exercises that he had gotten on his first trip to the bookstore. Seeing the first exercise was the leaf sticking exercise, he plucked a leaf from a nearby tree and began trying to hold it to his forehead with his chra. After 30 minutes of failure with the exercise because the leaf kept blowing off because of too much, Naruto decided to look at the next exercise in the scroll. The next exercise was called tree walking, and it went into an explanation on how it was possible and why it worked. Wasting no more time, Naruto started up the nearest tree and made it 3 steps before he was blown backwards into the ground. Several hours later, he was making fair progress up the tree, or at least not blowing off of it quite as badly as he had when he started. Another week passed with him working on the tree climbing exercise as well as studying the books that he had with him. He still wasn't very good at the exercise, but then again, he was a third of the way up the tree before he would be blown off. He had read all of the books that he had with him at least once and forced himself to understand what was contained in them. After the hand seal book and the elements of chakra books, he decided that with all of the differences that maybe he should try each hand seal combination and write what they did to his chakra, so that when he went to create jutsu he could use the information that he learned now to make it easier. Taking a blank journal that he had gotten with all of the other books, he took the first 12 pages and wrote out the names for the 12 standard hand signs, and after consulting the scroll about them, he wrote down everything that he knew about them in a simpler format. Forming each hand sign, he concentrated on the pattern that it formed in his chakra and what he thought it could do. From there he used another large part of the journal to record what he found out that the combinations of 2 or 3 hand seals did to his chakra. As he was starting on 4 hand seals, he found himself unwillingly creating techniques with the hand seal, because at that point the chakra needed an outlet because he couldn't control the larger patterns that formed in his chakra. As soon as he used 4 seals, his body that wasn't ready for it caused him to spit out a huge mouthful of mud. Recording that on a scroll, he started back on chakra control. 2 weeks of playing around with his techniques in the morning and working on his chakra control in the afternoon led him to completing the tree walking exercise and coming back to the leaf floating exercise. Now better able to keep the flow of his chakra, he wasn't blowing the leaf off quite as often as he had before. Another gain was that his hand sealed journal had much more filled in on each hand seal and how it worked from what his experimentation had revealed. Beyond that, he had also accidentally discovered another hand seal that wasn't present in any of his books or scrolls. When it had happened, he had been so surprised that he had released a burst of chakra into the hand seal and watched amazed as a small sapling in front of him suddenly burst upward to almost 3 times its starting height and started flowering. His amazement grew as the flowers fell and fruits grew in seconds, picking One of the fruit that he recognized from his survival book as edible but not currently in season, he bit into the fruit and found it much richer than any of the other fruits that he had gathered from the forest. Taking a new journal, he had recorded it as well as how each of the 12 other hand seals that he had known before affected it. The accidental discovery of that one in seal set him off on trying his hands in every position that he could think of until he lost his concentration while holding his fingers in a cross-shaped seal. A burst of chakra flared through the seal and, with a large puff of smoke, he was standing in front of 2 copies of himself with no idea of how he had done it. Writing down how he thought he had done it, he started to go back to trying random hand positions to see if he could find any more new seals when he felt slightly lightheaded and flopped back down to the ground and fell asleep from the chakra exhaustion that he had unknowingly caused himself from deep within. Naruto, the nine-tailed fox, watched these events with some boredom. The fox knew that because of the technique that had been used to imprison him here, the death god had a hand upon his soul. As soon as Naruto died, he would be judged upon life that he had lived. So, for the last 7 and some years he had spent waiting and only helping the boy's natural healing every once in a while. He had also heightened 2 portions of Naruto's personality that he thought would make his imprisonment at least more enjoyable. Oddly enough, his love of pranking people and his large appetite were genetic, and Kaba had increased both, only to ram his head against the bars of his cage in annoyance when he saw that he had unknowingly increased the genetic ramen addiction that his former container had also had, much to his annoyance. But for now he was running through his favorite memories from the past, both his own as well as his previous containers. He really hoped that Naruto would learn the art of the prank soon, because there were only so many times that he could run through his memories before his bloodlust got the better of him. Although his new container was doing something interesting at least, and guiding his mind into accidentally recreating the shadow clone technique was very fun now. If only he could guide Naruto to name it with its actual name, that would set up a situation later that would be amusing. At least waking up the next morning, he ate more than 3 times what he normally ate and thought back to the strange dreams that all seemed to revolve around 2 red-haired women pulling pranks at various ages. Getting back to his normal schedule, Naruto started through more random hand placements until he had run across several more that pulled his chakra into patterns. Thinking about the new patterns when he compared them to the 12 common hand seals patterns, he could only determine that the new hand seals that he was running across had weaker patterns. The weaker patterns were harder to sense when they were compared to the stronger patterns that belonged to the 12 basic hand seals. Finally running out of new ways to place his hands, he started back on the first and seal that he had discovered. Naruto started adding the 12 basic hand seals to it and watching the patterns form. Dutifully watching the patterns, he records what he thinks that they will do. Naruto came to the conclusion that while this hand seal might be connected to the wood style, anyone without the bloodline for it would just be generating growth in nearby plants, or that there might be something that he didn't know about it. Considering that his experimentation included causing fruit trees to grow as well as other edible plants, Naruto wasn't going to complain, because his campsite had been rapidly moving toward being uninhabitable. He had cleared out most of the edibles readily available in the area, and on his last food gathering trip he had to go quite a bit further than usual to get the food for the next several days. Moving on to the next hand seals, he continued experimenting with them in the morning and working on his chakra control in the afternoon. This process took up the next 2 weeks until he got to that odd cross-shaped hand seal and decided to experiment more on it, channeling a fair amount of chakra through the seal. He was rewarded with a puff of smoke and a clone formed. The last 2 weeks were largely confined to working on his chakra control and working on the clone jutsu that he decided to call the shadow clone jutsu, until he either thought of a better name or when he found out another name for it. 2 days were left until the academy was due to start back, and Naruto would start his second year there. Packing up his camp, Naruto was surprised that with all of the things that he had gathered, he had more to carry than he could carry on his own. Creating 2 shadow clones, he sent one off to return the academy's property that he had borrowed, while he and the other gathered his things to take back to his apartment, with the clone taking a different path than he was taking because of the possibility of being popped. During his training with the clones, he found out that whatever they learned, he learned, as well as the fact that for all that they were solid and could use jutsu was a bonus, but the fact that they would dispel in one hit was somewhat annoying. On his way back to his apartment, Naruto received the memories of the clone that was returning the camping equipment. Opening the door, he found his apartment trashed and with new graffiti on the walls, and he Was glad that he had gone camping over the break and that he had hidden all of his more important possessions that he didn't take with him. Resetting the traps around his apartment, Naruto started getting everything ready for his next year at the academy while mentally adding a book on basic seals when he could afford it. All of the time that he had left until the next year of the academy was used, and he was looking forward to another year at the academy. Stopping by the Hokage's office, Naruto was surprised when he was swept up into a hug by the old Hokage and asked if he had enjoyed his camping trip. While Naruto had been surprised that the old man had known that he had been camping, Naruto had enthusiastically replied that it had been the best time that he had had in a while, but that there wasn't any ramen. He also said that he couldn't wait for the academy to start back again because he had gotten so much stronger. Hyson smiled because it seemed that Nut's light-hearted personality had come back much more quickly than he had thought. It seemed that all he had needed was to get away from the village for a little while to let all of the negative emotions that he had been holding and work themselves out. Mentally, he also decided that should Naruto wish to, he would be allowed to camp out for all the remaining breaks between semesters in the academy, because with the way that Naruto's life had been going, it may very well help to allow him to disappear from the public eye for a while on those breaks. Yes, Naruto, that is all well and good here, as an interrupted Naruto from his babbling, which had been going on for several minutes. However, next time that you want to go camping, tell me ahead of time and I'll arrange for you to use the equipment that you borrowed from the academy. Since the break began, I had to fill out quite a few pieces of paperwork because of your last stunt. Naruto scratched the back of his head sheepishly and said, "Sorry, old man, a lot of my plans for when I went camping this last time were spur of the moment kind of thing." "Not to worry, Naruto here," Aizen said as he chuckled lightly. "I just had to fill out the requisition forms more quickly than I would have liked. Well, those in the appropriate set up permits for you to camp on that training field, so next time give me a week to sort out the paperwork if you decide to go camping again." "Thanks, old man," Naruto said in a loud voice as he thought about all the paperwork he had caused the Hokage. "As I said, it was no problem. I just would have liked to have had more time to look over the paperwork here," Aizen said to the grinning child. "Now why don't you go get a couple bowls of ramen on me?" Taking the Ryo that here had handed him, Naruto had disappeared out the door with a hastily yell. "Thanks, old man." Seeing that Naruto was fully gone and that the door to his office was closed once again, causing the seals that littered all the flat surfaces of the office once more become active, causing all the sounds from the office to once more be shrouded in silence. Here Aizen laughed somewhat bitterly to himself as he looked at a portrait of the fourth Hok on one of the walls and say, "He looks so much like you when you were younger, and yet he acts so much like that I'm amazed that none of the clan heads who knew you both have figured out that you were his parents. I don't know how good of an idea it is to let him disappear like that, but at this point it may be a good thing for a while, because while he was gone a lot of the rumors died down significantly. I don't know, but if he keeps laying low during the academy breaks and is seen moving around the village less often, more of the villagers may just let go of their hate of him." Sighing here, Aizen turned back to the stack of paperwork on his desk and started filling out forms once again before idly stopping and saying aloud, "Too many memories and too many regrets. I think that when I can finally turn over the hat again, I'm going to go on a long vacation, and then maybe I'll be able to look myself in the mirror again." Looking down at his hands here, Aizen and could barely see his own hands for all the blood that he still pictured upon them. Memories of his younger and more confident days played within his mind as he thought for almost an hour on all of the things that he had done in his long life. After leaving the Hokage's office, Naruto had gone to Chaku Ramen and gotten 7 bowls of ramen beyond the 2 that the Hokage had paid for because of how long he had been camping and training. Returning to his apartment, he felt bloated because of all of the ramen that he had eaten and fell asleep almost as soon as he entered the apartment. Waking up early the next morning, Naruto got up and had a small meal of fruit that he had brought back with him from his training over the academy break. Walking out of his apartment, he made his way back to the store where he had gotten all of his books so far and once again broken in. Started running through all of the titles that were in the normally available shelves and once again began building up a small stack of books on the counter in the front of the store. All 5 books on seals that were available to everyone made their way into the stack, along with several more of the optional books for the academy now that he could afford them. Before he stopped while thinking that he had spent enough on books for this trip. Stopping at that thought, Naruto quickly hurried back over to the book section and got a dozen blank journals and added them to the stack before hastily figuring out how much all the books and scrolls would cost him and put the correct amount into the cash register. Once again Naruto never noticed that he had been followed the entire time that he had been inside the store. Boar had been very bored on his rounds around the Leaf Village and was almost relieved to once again see Naruto breaking into the same store that he had broken into several months earlier. Once again following him, he saw almost the same thing that he had seen months earlier and once again saw Naruto pay for all the books that he had placed on the counter. Looking over the list, he saw that none of the books really had any paperwork to go with them and towed his curiosity. Followed Naruto again, dropping the books off at his apartment. Naruto made his way toward one of the few weapon shops that was run by one of the few people who didn't glare at him every chance that they got. Reaching the store, he stealthily snuck into the shop, not realizing that he had set off over half a dozen alarm seals on the way. Working his way around the shop, he picked up one of the basic weighted sets of Kai and one of the heavier sets before moving on to pulling out one of the starter sets that the shop normally sold to the students who were starting their second year in the academy. Looking over the items on the counter and thinking about how much money he had in his wallet, Naruto mentally nodded to himself for just barely staying under the amount that would still let him eat Ichiraku ramen at least once a week along with instant ramen at least once a day until he got his next stien from the Hokage. Pulling out the correct amount from his wallet, Naruto put the money into the register and gathered the items on the counter and started to make his way toward the door when a hand appeared on his shoulder. Boar followed after Naruto and watched him drop the books off at his apartment and was starting to get bored again until he saw Naruto once again setting out and attempting to sneak into the Demon Edge weapon shop. Knowing that the owner of the shop had the shop carefully set up with seals to prevent any thefts, Boar cautiously followed after Naruto, unknowingly setting off more alarms than Naruto had inside the shop. He saw the owner now awake and hidden in one of the corners of the shop, and knowing that Hideki was once and used one of the universal sign languages, quickly explained what he thought Naruto was doing in his shop as well as why he was there. Seeing the store owner nod and start to move out of the shadows, Boar moved closer to the conversation so that he could hear what Hideki was going to say to Nar. Hideki meanwhile had moved up behind Naruto silently and gently laid his hand on Naruto's shoulder before asking in his best annoyed voice, "Why did you break into my shop at this time of morning when all you would have had to do was wait another couple of hours and been able to shop like everyone else?" Naruto, who hadn't known that he had been discovered until the hand hit his shoulder, suddenly found himself nearly jumping out of his skin when the hand hit his shoulder and he was asked a question. Trying to hide his apprehension, Naruto almost didn't hear the question because of his internal panic, but managed to respond with, "Sorry sir, but most of the time when I try buying anything like this I'm thrown out of shops and glared at, so I was trying to get the supplies that I was going to need for the next year at the academy. I did pay for them if it helps any." The last bit was in the hopes that if he knew that Naruto had paid, then he would get out of a punishment for stealing. "I was watching almost since you entered the store, so yes, I know that you didn't steal anything," Hideki said as his face softened from the stern visage that it had initially taken in their encounter. "I think that I've seen you being thrown out of a couple stores before, so now that I think about it, it isn't surprising that you would do something like this. Don't worry about what those other stores might do or think of you, Naruto. Unlike them, I refuse to turn away a paying customer from our home, so you should have no worries about getting your weapons from here for the correct price." Seeing the shopkeeper honest smile toward the end, Naruto couldn't help but grin, even as he was helped to pick up all the packages that he had dropped without his noticing when he had been surprised by the shopkeeper. Naruto took his new weapons home soon after he had finished a discussion with the shopkeeper, who had introduced himself as Hideki Kazuki, about his thoughts on the weapons that had been required by the academy. In the end of the conversation, Hideki had added a scroll of sword stances and a boning with adjustable weight seals onto the order for free because, as he said, "Could you get way more negative reactions in this village than you deserve, and those right there are my way of trying to make some of that up to you, but I expect that in a couple years, that when you need a real blade, that you will come to me." Going back to the academy led to much the same treatment as he had received the previous year, and the books that he had publicly bought had the same glaring missing sections as the ones from the previous years, so Naruto laboriously worked his way through the altered books as well as the non-altered books that he had secretly bought, and just answered the questions that were in his altered books correctly when he could have answered them all correctly easily. Every time he was kicked out of class, Naruto would go off and work on his own training, because usually when he had Been kicked out of class, he wouldn't be allowed back in for the rest of the day. On Saturdays he would show up for the weekly taijutsu regimen that the academy followed and be berated by the instructor for most of the class about how his form wasn't correct at all, while he praised a large number of the other students even if they had much less perfect forms than Naruto. The academy followed a very basic setup in that it ran almost mandatory classes starting at 8 o'clock in the morning, which ran until 1 in the afternoon, at which time it let out for an hour for lunch, which was followed by many optional lectures in the afternoon. Saturday afternoon and Sunday the academy was closed to give the teacher some time off other than the one taijutsu lesson on Saturday. All the students were expected to practice and improve on their own. It was in fact another perk for those who were from a clan or got an older ninja to sponsor some of their learning. That was the way that Naruto spent his time at the academy for the first 2 months of his second year. However, outside of the academy he was working very hard on his chakra control and running through the correct tattoo forms. Every evening he would pull out the kenjutsu scroll that he had been given and go through the basic stretching exercises on it. With the band being progressively more weighted, he didn't work on the techniques very much except for running through all the ones that he knew about once a week, ending with the ones that he just couldn't seem to get to work. That isn't to say, however, that he neglected to attempt to make new techniques at that time. It was just that he left that up to the groups of 5 shadow clones that he would make daily. He also dumped off his training in seals of on his clones because of all the things that could go wrong with it when he had still been doing the sealing training himself. He had successfully made a very basic training seal that just made all of the chakra that was put into it into a progressively stronger light. One of the functions of the seal was that it could only take so much chakra, and it had almost promptly burned out on his first use. After emitting a blinding flash of light, the seal was used to determine exactly how much chakra you were putting into the seals that you made, and the goal was to get just a tiny amount of light. For an hour after the mishap, he decided that it would be better if he just left the study to his clones until they mastered segments of the art, then he could try them with the knowledge of how to do so. On the technique front, he had managed to modify 2 of the techniques with an added hand seal to their sequences. The Ember Spark technique was normally used to quickly start a small fire with minimal chakra expended, and when enough chakra was added it could be used to start even wet wood burning. Naruto had taken the technique and made it able to extend over anything that he could hold in his hand. Of course, smaller objects that weren't flammable worked better with the technique. Kite particularly worked well with the technique. The other technique that he had managed to modify was the water condensation technique, which took the moisture from nearby and condensed it into drinking water. The new technique would let him condense the water away from his body as opposed to the original, which had to happen right next to him. Other than those 2 successes, he had only managed to learn a huge number of ways to fail, some quite amusing failures. Later, and Naruto was brought back to all of the times that he had dreamed of the 2 red-headed women pranking people. Thinking about it for a while, he decided to start pranking all the people that would throw him out of stores for no reason and other like events. Thinking about it more, he got a slight gleam in his eye as well as a vulpine grin stretching across his face as he thought about what he was going to do to his academy teachers several miles away from where Naruto was training for the day. A large number of people felt a huge shiver run down their spine, which only a few of the oldest ones recognized from their younger days when a certain red-headed Uzumaki would unleash her outrageous pranks on them. Most of them shuddered and thought about the only current person with the name Uzumaki in the village, and mentally decided that if he took up the title that Kosha had once held, that it might be a good idea to get on his good side for a while to hopefully get out of any revenge pranks that he had to be planning, not knowing that a vast majority of his lower priority targets were rushing to get out of the firing line. Naruto ran through a plan in his head that he knew would work and had the added benefit of using one of his failures at making techniques into something truly awe-inspiring. During his experimentation time, Naruto had only really had the 2 techniques that he had found any use for in combat conditions, of course creating water on command from the moisture in the air and then using it for water techniques was one, and coating weapons and smoldering embers was the other. But during that time he had also run into a few dozen Semite techniques that he couldn't find a combat use for. He had duty recorded them in a blank journal and promptly forgot about them. His first prank was going to involve one of the water modifications that he had come across when experimenting, which he called water-style paint gathering. As the name suggests, it gathers paint from the air. Like the original gathers water, or more accurately it gathers water and using the chakra mix changes the waters. Consistency to look like a heavy oil-based paint. It looked and felt like oil-based paint, however it was still really water and reacted to coming into contact with normal water by reverting into the water it formerly was. That had been the main reason that the technique had been scrapped. However, for Naruto's prank it would be perfect because after he was through you could just take a damp cloth and clean up easily. The next morning when the academy teachers showed up, their mouths fell open, and as when they turned toward the only student who was openly laughing at the sight of the academy coated in neon orange paint tick marks on their foreheads, they yelled in unison, "Uzumaki detention!" For the next several months Naruto's training held steady as he improved in all of the areas that he was working on, somewhat steadily if slightly slower than he would have liked. The reason that he wasn't improving as fast as he would have liked was because of the fact that after he had read through the books on seals he had decided that if people could do all of those things with seals, then if he managed to get far enough into the art that he could use it to improve his other training also. Oddly enough, as he worked his way through all the publicly available books he found that of all the ninja arts this one was of the easiest for him to learn. One of the examples that was mentioned was the gravity seal that had been developed by the wife of the first Hokage. He hadn't seen an example of it, but it was one of the seals that he wanted to learn how to use to increase his training's effectiveness. Several of the simple seal examples that had been shown in the books that he had gotten had already duplicated, while still missing several of the underlying theories he learned them during the construction of the seals. Finally getting fed up with the lack of information on seals, he focused back on his other training and cut his sealing training back drastically, because all of the seals that he could make were training seals that did work but didn't have very big effects, such as the seal that slowed the air that passed the seal. It was a good training seal, but there wasn't very much that could be done with it. Naruto was also very hesitant to experiment with sealing, unlike ninjutsu, because of the warnings written in the front of all the sealing books that he had gotten his hands on. He only managed to discover one more thing before the short winter break, unlike what some of his history books stated about some countries. Fire Country never really got snow or any of the other winter weather that Naruto had read about. His latest discovery though helped him immensely, because he had discovered that the biggest problem that he had with most of the techniques that he couldn't get to work was that he had much larger chakra capacity than what the book said was normal for his age. By stringing together two of the hand seals that he had discovered along with the ram seal and the sheep seal, he could temporarily increase his chakra control. Of course, the set of hand seals would only help him with his control for about 5 minutes before his control would fall right back to where it was before. By performing the set of seals 4 times in a row, he managed to get the academy clone technique to work, but was almost exhausted afterwards. The books that he had gotten for the academy only mentioned 2 exercises and recommended that those interested should ask their academy instructor for more information, or to purchase one of the books on the optional list that Naruto hadn't gotten yet. He had been saving since his last covert shopping trip and practicing his stealth since he had been caught on his last trip. He was idly planning his next nighttime shopping trip when a memory surfaced that he had completely forgotten about. The Leaf Village Public Library held copies of all the books that were publicly on sale in the Leaf Village, as well as a large number that weren't available anymore. The memory was back in the beginning of his first academy year, and he had been acting as if he was asleep on the hope that the instructor wouldn't throw him out again. The instructor had recommended that they all purchase their own books, but that because it had a number of copies of books that were out of print, that it might be a good idea to check out their copies, because what with all of the revising as well as the rewritten sections of their current books, that if any of the subjects interested them to a great extent, that they should look into the books at the library to learn more on the subjects, comparing the price of the rest of the optional books for the academy against the amount that he could afford to spend. Naruto nodded his head as he saw that he had enough to purchase them all, provided it was during a nighttime visit. Searching his memory as to why he had forgotten about the copies of old textbooks being kept at the public library, Naruto finally remembered that he had tried to get into the library several times when he had been younger, only to be tossed out by one of the 4 shifts of librarians who had said that they wouldn't allow someone like him to sully their precious books. He hadn't tried to go back since the library was near the shop that Naruto was going to get some more of the optional books at. That night he decided to take a look around after he was done getting the books and dropping them Back off at his apartment after once again sneaking into the same bookstore, Naruto gathered up the last of the books that were on the optional list of books for the academy, as well as another dozen blank journals, and put the correct amount of Rio for them into the register before quickly exiting the store. Unlike the previous times that he had entered the store in that manner, he wasn't observed because he luckily caught gaps in the patrol schedule for the night. That's not to say that he wasn't seen by P and U on patrol, but rather that unlike before, they didn't see him sneak into the store. Dropping the books off at his apartment, Naruto got ready for a look around the library. Reaching the library was very simple because it was the public library and held no classified information at all. It was open from 7 in the morning until 900 in the evening because it saw most of its use from the civilian members of the village. There weren't even any defenses on the building because of the fact that it only held publicly available information. In books, sneaking in was easy as well with what shinobi training that he had. Immediately making his way toward the shinobi section of the library, Naruto started scanning the titles and mentally comparing them to the books that he already had, and found that there were a great many books that had been dropped from the academy syllabus over the time that the academy had been open. Pulling a notebook from his pocket, Naruto started jotting down titles in the order that he wanted to read them. When he had a full page, he pulled down the first book on his list and started through it. The next week went smoothly because it was the short winter holiday that the academy let out for every year. During the day, Naruto was continuing his previous schedule, except that he had added a 3-hour nap in the afternoon, so that he was more awake on his trips to the library after it was closed every night. Since the first, he would read 2 or 3 of the books from his list that he hadn't read yet and copy any sections that he found interesting over to one of his blank journals. During that first week, he had filled up 3 of the books while reading with the academy, starting Rahul by Asta group. Again at the end of the week though, Naruto had to change his schedule once again and found that his training suffered because he was having to use the time he had for it to sleep so that he could sneak into the library to look for more books. Naruto even had to slow down on the pranks that he had been so coming to enjoy with his new schedule. He only had time to plan and pull one prank every other week. On the upside of this was that he was ending up in detention less often and had a little more time than he thought he would have that he used to keep skills he had in practice. It took just about the rest of the semester to finish off all the books on his list that he wanted to read in the library. After he had finished the last one, he had looked over the titles again and made another list for when he got back from the camping trip that he had been planning for over the break after the success of the camping trip he had gone on the previous year. On the last week before the break, Naruto had gone to see the HOK and had been told to see him after the academy let out for its summer break, and he would have all of the paperwork complete for Naruto to camp on one of the lesser used training grounds. Finishing off the week had been very hard on Naruto because of his promise to himself that he wouldn't use anything except what he learned in the academy on the academy level tests until he had graduated and could show his true skill. Over the week, he had also packed up all the things that he thought that he might need on his camping trip and hidden the rest of the things that he wanted to keep in good condition in a hidden recess that he had secretly made in the ceiling of his apartment. He had very carefully made sure that the hidden area was water and fireproof, because he didn't exactly trust some of the villagers not to try and burn his apartment down just to hurt him in any manner that they could. Leaving his pack on the table, Naruto made his way toward the Hokage's office. Entering the office, Naruto saw the Hokage sitting behind the desk with a huge stack of paperwork nearly hiding him from view. Looking up at the sound of the door opening, Hiran smiled as he saw Naruto and said to Naruto, "I was wondering when you would get here. I've arranged for you to be able to camp out on training ground 74 because of where it is. Not many of the ninja use it regularly. It is near the wall that surrounds the village, just behind and to the left of the HOK monument. Now I know that you probably have arranged everything that you want train in while you're camping on the brack, but I took the liberty to pack this scroll with some scrolls that might help your training, as well as including a set of chakra weights. Taking the scroll as well as the small map that the HOK was offering him, Nar got a fairly big grin on his face because he just got access to 2 of the seals that were interesting to him. Of course, the chakra weights could be the other type than he thought they were and have a weight seal on them instead of a gravity seal. Even if that was the case, he would still be able to study the seals because he would probably have to give the weights back at the end of the summer break. Sitting up in his cage, the Kaba finally left the state that it had been in for the past year when the seal had finally hit the point where it snapped back to its Normal position Kaui had learned a valuable lesson that day. The seal would only stretch so far and it would absorb some of the chakra that would pass through it for any purpose he used it. For after it got enough chakra it would unleash it back into the fox in as damaging a manner possible. Kyubi hadn't been in this much pain since that damn ox had shot a badama up his rear as a joke. Quickly sorting through all the memories that he had access to, Kaui grinned at what Naruto had managed to accomplish. While he had been asleep, also seeing Naruto remember some of the more pleasant memories that he dreamed about gave him the hope that if he ran through all his memories of Mito teaching KHA sealing that maybe Naruto would learn some of unique Uzumaki sealing style. If nothing else, it would be a good experiment to see if it would work. Setting up his tent in the small clearing in Training Ground 74, Naruto was looking around the clearing and mentally planning where he would set everything else up, having 2 clones out and gathering up wood for when he was cooking. Naruto pulled out and started arranging the things that he had packed. Finished with setting up camp, Naruto pulled out the scroll that he had been given by the Hokage. Pulling out his sealing journal, he quickly copied over the storage seal and started mentally trying to pull its components apart, trying to figure out how it worked. Quickly creating another clone to contemplate the seal he was working on, Naruto started on one of his workout routines to see if he would have any inspiration on how it worked randomly, because he knew that he didn't know all of the theories behind how the seal worked. Working out how the storage seal worked ended up taking him almost 3 days. And he was still working on understanding it completely. He understood it well enough to duplicate it, however, and using the theories that he had discovered about it as well as what he already knew, he developed over 4 dozen seals that he thought should work but hadn't tested yet because of the warnings in the books he had on sealing. Finished with the storage seal for now, Naruto started on the weight seals and found that they were weight seals and not the gravity seals as he had hoped. The weight seal was more complex than the storage seal by far and took him almost 3 weeks to duplicate, with some of his failures producing rather funny effects when he had his clone test them. Of course, there were a number of effects that one would expect from a seal that manipulated the weight that it was on, such as the clone that had been dispelled when it had activated the seal and been drugged to the ground so fast it had dispelled, while the seal had made a 5-foot across crater. Then there was the clone that had disappeared with the scrap of paper it had been practicing on when the seal had come out reversed to what it should have been in. Started producing a negative weight. All of the failures taught him about the weight seal, though, so each one was useful in learning about the theories behind the seal. The scrolls that the HOK sent along were useful in some cases, but he had copies of about half of them before the Hokage gave them to him. The scrolls that he didn't already have were the half a dozen books about chakra control and non-combat uses, about a dozen on history, and a very large one that contained every law that had ever been written in the Hidden Leaf Village. Of course, it didn't contain any of the S-class proclamations, but it did hold the active laws of the village. One of the laws in particular caught his eye in that it stated that any business that was within the Leaf Village couldn't deny service or charge larger prices to any registered shinobi. Of course, the law was written in more formal language and much longer, but that was what it boiled down to, and the law also applied to academy students. 1 month of his break was gone and all of the training he had done had been on seals and his exercise routines, while it had advanced his study of the subject of sealing by many times. Where it had been, Naruto decided that it was time to get back to researching hand seals. He had learned how to use all of the techniques that were in his academy books and even gotten about a half a dozen combat usable modifications available among the variations that he had tried. Of course, there were still the few techniques that he had seen, like the water dragon, that he still couldn't figure out because of a few things about the technique that he didn't know yet. Figuring out how to do all of the chakra control exercises as well as finding out why he couldn't use the water dragon took up another 2 weeks of his break, leaving him with just another 4 weeks left before he would have to head back to the Leaf Village. As it turned out, the reason that he couldn't figure out the water dragon was that it was used with elemental chakra that took care of about a quarter of the seals used to form it. Elemental chakra was, according to his books, about 5 times as hard to control as just normal chakra, but that every single high-level elemental technique used it instead of the reg chakra. Most C-ranked and below techniques could be used with normal chakra, however, any higher, and they shifted to the elemental chakras. This didn't count the techniques that just required a huge amount of chakra being poured into the techniques. The rest of his break was sped working on learning to use elemental chakra as well as increasing his exercise routines by looking over his books again. He had Figured out that if he managed to put elemental chakra into things, then it would have varying results, and that it, because of the chakra papers that he had read about, it would be easiest to use leaves to try and mimic the results with. Himself working on water element chakra, Naruto had a clone working on each element, and they would switch off every hour that they worked on the exercises, walking back toward the Leaf Village on the second to last day of his break. Naruto couldn't help but smile at that he had learned over the break and his plans on how he wanted to use it in the next year. Walking back into the village, Naruto couldn't help but think over all that he knew on chakra control, and a sudden thought struck him: all of the control exercises that he knew about other than the starter exercises for the elemental chakras were either academy level or from the books that the Hokage had said with him. The problem was that most of the exercises that he had just learned were set up for those that were Naruto's age and younger, and made to be game-likey to get the student to learn how to correctly feel and draw their chakra. None of them increased his control by very much, and if what he felt was correct, his chakra pool was still growing, and what little control he had was slipping. Some that settled it he was going to need to find more advanced chakra control exercises, as well as probable invent his own. That one-hand seal sequence he had discovered would help, but it was going to take a lot more work to really improve on it without resorting to the crutch that he had discovered pulling the scroll that he had copied all of the chakra control exercises over. He figured that the only ones that might still help him were the leaf floating exercise and the light seal sealing exercise. With the leaf floating exercise, he could probably try and stick the leaf to other parts of his body, as well as try and use heavier objects. For that matter, it might help if he used many different objects with different weights while constantly moving them around. Who knows, if he could keep objects stuck to his feet, maybe he could eventually move up to keeping himself stuck to walls and other vertical surfaces. Quickly he wrote his thoughts in a small journal. He had decided to keep up with them, so when he had training ideas that he could write them down to get back to later. He was still contemplating giving journals to each group of training clones when they started training, because who knows when inspiration would strike after dropping his stuff off at his apartment, which was in noticeably better condition than when he had gotten back to it the previous year. Naruto smiled, because apparently the amount of hate for him in the village had dropped just a bit more. He might not know the reason for the hate, but he could just about see it there if he wasn't seen around the village for a while longer. Then maybe he could start to slip more into the background. Thinking about it, the first thing that came to mind was the transformation jutsu taught at the academy, but that wouldn't truly get him as far under the radar as he wanted, because it was just a jutsu rather than a physical transformation. One of his books that was supplementary for the academy mentioned that physical transformation techniques would be a high beat to a low S rank technique because of the difficulty involved in the transition, as well as the fact that each transformation would have to be understood from the inside out before it was even attempted. This was because of the fact that if you messed anything up, then there was the chance that you wouldn't be able to return to your original form before you died from the M transformation. As to the technique itself, the scroll had mentioned that there were several reports of ninja from various countries mastering it. However, due to its difficulty, most who tried to use it died in the process of learning it. With that information in mind, Naruto decided that he would probably need a bit higher than medic level anatomy information before he jumped into trying to make a physical transformation on himself, but that wouldn't stop him from trying it on his shadow clones. So far, since the end of the first year of the academy, Naruto had invented just over 100 techniques. However, all of them, except 4 or 5 of them, had little to no combat application that he could think of. Then again, more than half of them were seals that he had invented by mixing and matching what he knew of other seals and the theories behind how they worked. Of course, that was a trial and error process, and he had to be careful about how much he experimented with them. Having clones do the experimenting was extremely helpful, because if he had done the experimenting himself, he wouldn't have lived past his 3rd experiment with the storage scroll, which had swallowed up his clone and subjected it to an extremely unstable gravity well until it had finally popped, giving him memories of a bizarre bubble of space which had moved and wobbled in a nauseating display of other worldly geometries. Getting to the Hokage's office made him drop his line of thinking as he smiled at Siri Toby behind the desk. He wasn't in the office for very long, and most of the conversation was over how well his last camping trip was. Naruto held a lot of things back about his self-training and really only admitted to putting a lot of time on training what his books recommended that he train on here is, and for his part wasn't really fooled. He knew that Naruto hadn't told him Everything that he had been working on because he had caught a few of Naruto's training sessions and had seen several of the jutsu Naruto had invented. To be honest, he had to check the descriptions in his personal library to find out where Naruto had learned them, and had been surprised when he had found out that there wasn't any proof that any shinobi had ever used them before. Here as in just hoped that Naruto managed to become strong quickly enough because he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep others' hands off of Naruto's inheritance. The last time any of it had disappeared, he had to have you that he trusted with the secret of Naruto's heritage track down all the missing items. It had taken them almost 6 months to find it all. All of the jutsu scrolls were safely tucked away in the small cottage that Minato had owned that bordered on Training Ground 82 behind an almost impenetrable barrier that was Minato's own design. It would take a tremendous amount of force to break through the barrier of a property that everyone assumed belonged to Ja after his students passing. The more problematical things were the fact that a great number of items belonging to Minato and Kha weren't behind that barrier but rather scattered on the other several properties that they had both owned in the Leaf Village. There had also been 30 attempts to drain both of their accounts in the largest branch of the Fire Country Bank. Both had kept a modest account at every branch of the bank, as most shinobi did when going on missions successively, so as to have funds constantly available. Unlike most other shinobi, however, they didn't keep their main account in the Leaf Village branch, but rather they kept it at the main branch in the capital because of the fact that both of them had reached over the limit for their accounts in the Leaf Village branch. Every single one of the clans in the Leaf Village had that same situation happen to them because they all were prosperous enough that it could affect the entire Fire Nation's economy. If any of them were to remove their entire net worth from the banking system at once, the bypass of this was that the clans kept their main account in the main branch while each clan member kept their personal account in the Leaf Village branch. Nearly all of Naruto's inheritance was frozen until he either became a Jan or when he hit 16. Currently, Naruto was getting nearly double the usual orphan's allowance because Irisin had set it up so that Naruto would get an equal amount to the allowance from his parents' accounts every time he got an amount. Thinking back, Hurin was surprised that it had been almost a year and a half since he had last checked Naruto's inheritance. Luckily, there was a meeting that he could attend in the capital in just a couple of weeks that would allow him to double-check the books on the inheritance while he was there. Maybe while he was gone he should assign Ja to inspect the various seals around the village and make sure that they were still in good working order. That way he could also pass the emergency powers over to Ja and Shikaku while he was gone. But those who knew of Naruto's heritage, the accountant in charge of the accounts was one as was the Fire Lord, because Hyson didn't want there to be any possibility of someone else making off with Nut's inheritance. The citizens of the Leaf Village already treated him like garbage and tried to hurt him in any manner that they thought that they could get away with. Hen was always particularly harsh with those who tried to physically hurt him because it was much easier to prove what they had done than those who had tried to do things to him. Mentally, with a heavy sigh, Hyson cut off that line of thinking and returned to his paperwork while idly planning out his mini vacation to the capital. Naruto, for his part, after the meeting with the Hokage was over, made his way toward one of the few stores that didn't overcharge him in the village and purchased a great number of things that he wanted to try with the fruits and vegetables that he had brought back with him from vacation the previous year. When he had run out after his vacation, he had made his way to Training Ground number 12, which was the closest to his apartment, and went into one of the more secluded clearings and started making the clearing larger and turning it into his own private garden of sorts. After every one of his sessions, he only left turned earth and the large fruit trees that he had grown in the time since then. Only one other person had seen the garden when Naruto had grown himself more food easily with his plant growth technique. It had been about the middle of the previous year that Hinata Hyuga had started to stop Naruto in Urn and would sneak off for anywhere from 5 minutes to an hour from the Hyuga that was supposed to be escorting her. Even with his improved awareness from training, he still had yet to notice her. Most of the things that Naruto bought at the store were from the meat and the spice sections because he already got most of the other things that he needed in his diet from what he grew on his own. Besides, all of the things that he grew were much more appealing than the items of the same variety that the store sold. Most, if not all, the recipes that Naruto knew came from a very slim volume that not even the most dedicated of villagers bothered in his apartment because it was a very common book. The book was titled 10 Easy Meals That Every Bachelor Should be Able to Make. 90% of the population of the Leaf Village had the book in their kitchens, so it wasn't an uncommon book. So most of them overlooked it because they were more focused on wrecking the place than on what he was eating besides. It was a well-known fact that he almost completely subsisted off of ramen if any of the villagers had ever looked inside. Of the to cover they would have wondered why the demon brat had a cookbook that had once belonged to Minato. Namazi, the reason he had the book was that shortly after he got his apartment from the Sanden and had stated his dream about being Hokage, Hen had given him the book saying that it was a very common book but that he had seen the fourth Hokage making and eating the very recipes from the book that he gave Naruto until he got his unaltered Academy books. Naruto just hadn't cared so long as he managed to keep himself fed on his allowance the third HOK made his trip toward the capital with a sigh while thinking that this was just what he needed to get a good break in his routine. His paperwork had seemed to be getting denser and denser over the past several months, so he had to cut back on the few training sessions that he still put into keeping his skills somewhat sharp. The last week had been spent either doing his paperwork or working with his Anu to find about 20 items that had mysteriously disappeared from one of the Namazi estates. All that he had left to do was check the main records at the bank, and then he could enjoy his few days away from the paperwork before it tried to devour him again. Hideki opened a small metal door in his office that he usually had hidden underneath his desk chair. Looking down the familiar stairs, he thought about how long it had been since he had opened his secret vault. Waving his hand over the wall, he channeled a fair amount of chakra into one of the seals on the wall. He grinned slightly as the long disused lighting seals flickered for a second before turning completely on. Walking down the stairs and looking at the vault door that stood in front of him made him smile again, because only he and one other had ever truly known how large the room inside really was because of the internal expansion seals, allowing the room to be much larger on the inside than the outside. Cutting his hand as he channeled his chakra, he placed his hand in a small circle on the door, and with a loud clicking sound the door opened. Entering the vault, he looked at the side of the vault directly across from him and smiled as he looked at the libraries worth of scrolls that it housed. An entire copy of the Uzumaki library, he said with a sigh as he thought about what he was about to do. On a table in front of the scrolls was a sword that lay in almost 30 pieces. Looking over his greatest creation, he still felt proud that it had survived being used against the Saw's claws during the Kaba attack. Kushina had been an expert swordswoman, and he hadn't had any regrets on giving Naruto a practice blade in the first scroll on the style that his mother favored in combat. The librarian in front of him had been Ken's way of making sure that her family's knowledge survived longer than she did in case something unfortunate happened. Her precautions had been well warranted in Hideki's mind, especially after what had happened to her on the night of Naruto's birth. Picking up one of the scrolls that sat on the small shelf next to the door, he looked back at the library and wondered what would have happened if she had lived past the first few hours after Naruto's birth. Stepping out of the vault, he closed the door with a sigh as he wondered when the next time that he would go into it would be. When Kha had asked him to look after the copy of her family's library, she had made copies of several scrolls and told him that they were his just in case any of his children wanted to become shinobi. Unfortunately, even though Tenten was an academy student, he didn't think that she was ready for what was in those scrolls. Reaching his thinking room, he slowly unrolled the scroll he had taken from the vault. Looking on the semi-familiar plans for a small number of swords, his mouth started to involuntarily twist into a smile. Kha had helped him come up with these designs more than 15 years previously, and since her death he had locked them away. If what he had seen was correct, Naruto was teaching himself seals, and if that were true, then maybe he could make some more of these blades. Once again, the academy had finally started in on actually using chakra, unlike the past 2 years when it focused on teaching about what chakra was during the first year and on how to unlock and manipulate it during the second year. Of course, that was an oversimplification because of all the other subjects and demonstrations that were taught at the academy, but until the third year of the curriculum, 3/4 of the classes taught at the academy were theory-based lectures about what would be expected of them when and if they became shinobi. The final quarter was the stealth courses, which were optional so long as you went through all of them at least once in the exercise times, where they performed basic strengthening exercise as well as working their way through the beginning forms of the basic academy taijutsu style. That was what was taught in the first 2 years, along with the number of optional lectures that could be attended by students in any grade. The third year, however, scaled back on the theory and instead started focusing in on applying it. Along with increasing their skills, the third year also started having the students physically compete with each other in a number of ways, with the most prominent being the taijutsu sparing. All the students in the class were expected to perform their best on the third year at the academy. Was also the first cut year. By the end of the year, every student was expected to be able to pull off some sort of effect with their chakra, even if it wasn't the main jutsu. That the academy focused on third year at the academy focused on the clone jutsu, the fourth year focused on the transformation, and the fifth and final year focused on the replacement jutsu. A student the previous year named Rock Lee had barely managed to pass the year when he had managed to project a small amount of rot chakra that was just barely visible. Of the three jutsu, Naruto could only manage the replacement jutsu about half the time because of his lack of control, and of the other two techniques he could only manage to pull them off correctly when he cheated by using several seals that he had designed to help him regulate the amount of chakra he put into the technique, or if he used the hand seal sequence that he had discovered several times in a row before attempting the technique. Looking over the altered books that he had once again purchased, Naruto was amazed that whoever was doing this had managed to get him books that were almost useless 3 years in a row because he had publicly bought them in 3 different stores, and yet again the books were missing pages and other pages were horribly altered, with their information more likely to kill him than save his life. Luckily none of the shopkeepers had discovered his nighttime visits except Hideki, and unlike most of the village, he actually seemed to like Naruto. There might have been others, but as he only bought what he couldn't get for himself, he wouldn't know most of the other restaurants in the village that he had been to, except each Chiraku treated him the same as the stores. Figuring out the hand signs for the transformation technique wasn't very hard because he had actually run across them during one of his clones experimenting with techniques that used 2 of the hand seals that he had run across earlier. When placed into the hand sign sequence for the transformation, it worked, and he could see that it worked. However, he would need to continue reading up on anatomy because every time he had a clone try the jutsu, it would die from getting the technique wrong. Fortunately, every time he made a mistake, he could feel in his clone's memories where he was going wrong with the technique, by which area had hurt the most. The technique also had the advantage in that it required a great deal less control because he wasn't having to constantly sync the illusion with the surroundings, and in that it used nearly 4 times the amount of chakra that the replacement jutsu required. When the chakra required got into those amounts, it was finally easier for him to produce and expel the correct amount rather than badly overload the technique. On his study of anatomy, he had already read and understood about a dozen books on human anatomy, 3 on canine anatomy, 2 on feline anatomy, and 1 on the anatomy of fish, which had been mis-shelled in the library. At this point they knew enough of the basics to use the technique, but there were 2 real stopping points for him before he would try it on himself. The first was that his clones still damaged themselves out of existence whenever they used it, while the other was that on the few he did get it to work for a few minutes, the technique didn't dispel because it was a true transformation. The first obstacle could be overcome with enough training, while the second would require a specialized dispelling technique because the original didn't work on a true transformation. One of his other projects had had a breakthrough as well, but with just over 3 months left in the academy year before they let out for the next winter break, Naruto wasn't sure how much longer it would be before he managed to figure out the end product, but he had finally figured out another stable weight seal. This one would multiply gravity on an object based on how many times it was set for, but the problem was that if he put it on himself, it would try and rip all of his chakra out to multiply the gravity effect on him as many times possible, or at least that was what it did to the clones that he had tried it on. He managed to make it useful by applying it to a set of full body weight so that it would pull the correct effect on both him and the weights, but for what he wanted it for, it wasn't working right yet. He could use it while training as long as he wasn't actively using chakra except to power the gravity effect. It did wonders for his physical training, and it did help him with his controlled training, though research for the project they might just take priority over the true transformation that he was working on if he managed to make another breakthrough on it. Since he had started, he had managed to fill 7 of the journals that he had been writing his technique ideas in. He was also running low on scrolls that he was writing his completed techniques on. One of his idle ideas was to get several scrolls the size of the Forbidden Scroll and transfer all of his finished techniques to them, but scrolls of that size weren't on sale at any of the shops in the village. In fact, the only place he would be able to get scrolls that size would be in the tower, in the one storage room where they kept spares since he had gotten back from his summer camping trip. He had slept through most of the lectures and continued working on his tests and assignments with answers that he was awake for in class as well as those from his altered books. Other than that, he had been training as hard as he could with just enough presence in the village to let them know that he was still there, but keeping out of the way. The villagers couldn't hold a grudge forever, and with his diminished presence in the village, most of the villagers didn't really hate him anymore. They didn't like him, but without having to deal with seeing him all the time, as well as the positive rumors that the Hokage was spreading through the village. There were a large number of pranks that quite a lot of people wanted to lay at his feet, but they could never quite get proof that he was the one to pull them, because whenever one was pulled, he was very visible in another part of the village, just barely passing the academy, while part of the plan was starting to get annoying because he had made quite a few flashy techniques since he had figured out how the hand seals pulled his chakra into different patterns, but he hadn't shown them to anyone right now. He had several dozen scrolls with his own personal notes on how he had developed each and every seal and jutsu that he had come up with, even if most would only be support in the field at most. Even if most of the techniques he made turned out to be useless, he was still learning new things from every one of them, including his failures. Naruto's accelerated studies went on even as he did lackluster in class and bottomed out on the theory portions of the academy, and only showed that he did lots of exercises in the physical portions of the material. Often on the physical portion he had to force himself to fail it. In early November he perfected his physical transformation jutsu well enough that he was able to perfect one form. With it he could now transform into what he thought he would look like when he got older, by about 10 years of course. He knew that he got it very off from what he would probably really look like, but he had fun imagining what he would look like after he got that part down. He had come to the hardest part for him, choosing what features to alter just enough so that no one would suspect him. His hair was the first major change. His transformation had brown hair. Changing the type of clothes he was wearing had come next, and he had picked a type of clothes that were common in the civilian portion of the village to better blend in. Getting rid of his whisker marks turned out to be almost impossible, so in the end he had just wound up moving them to the back of his head. With his disguise he could walk around the village with no one the wiser. If it took him almost another week to set up the paperwork for his transformation and get it discreetly filed into the system, he had almost gotten caught while he was doing this, but because of the person working in the office while he was forging records for his transformation was both bored beyond belief as well as completely swamped with routine paperwork, as well as just inattentive to the extra papers that he had allowed to be filed with his adult identity settled. Naruto decided that it might be a good idea to up the available funds that he had to spare. Sure, his stash had been growing for over a year from his not buying anything from the village if he could avoid it, with the exception of ramen and the books for his shinobi career, but that wouldn't be nearly enough for the idea that he had. There were 4 main market areas in the Leaf Village, with each of them in one of the 4 cardinal directions from the center of the village. Both the western and southern markets were mainly imported goods as well as souvenirs from the village, because those were the sections of the village that most visitors were allowed unrestricted access to. The northern district was filled with shops that catered to the more wealthy among the village's inhabitants as well as the more wealthy of the visitors. However, the visitors were almost always monitored while they were in this section. The eastern market, on the other hand, dealt with just about everyone else and had all the things that couldn't be found at the general stores all over the village. After setting up his permits and purchasing the rights to one of the empty stalls for 2 months, Naruto's extra funds were nearly depleted, and he had been just about to pick up some more blank scrolls and ink for his experiments as well. So if his plan didn't work, he would have to slow down his plans for the next month or so, as well as cut down on his ramen intake, because all of the ramen in his apartment would only go so far, even if he was rationing it later in the night after he had bought the rights to the small stand in the eastern market. Naruto was one again in the small field where he used the jutsu he had accidentally created almost 2 years before he started to grow some of the more common fruits and vegetables that could be gotten around the Leaf Village seasonally and carefully pack in them into crates. The crates had rather amateurish ceiling arrays on them that were nearly identical to ones that he had seen in the northern market at a small fresh produce shop, and memorized the seals would slow down the time on anything inside the crate as long as it was sealed, and the seals were charged with chakra. Naruto's copy of the seals followed the same setup but wouldn't slow the time down nearly as much when the crates were sealed using clones under illusion transformations. He used a small cart to move the crates to the stall that he had rented. Setting up the stall took most of the morning. After the Clones had been given fake money and had run off while being heard discussing what they were going to do with it. Remembering the approximate prices that the shop in the northern market had on its produce, Naruto priced his produce at about half of the other store's price. He probably could have priced it higher, but as he had put on his sign, he was just opening for the first time and needed to make a quick profit to make up for the expense of opening the stall. Most of the morning people on their shopping trips would idly look at his shop and whisper about it with those that they had come with when he had removed the sign that said that he was still setting up for the day and to try again later in the day. His stall was immediately shut down while several anew ran over the stall and produced for anything out of the ordinary. Finding nothing wrong with the food, they let him open back up, and this time as people would pass they would look at some of the samples that he had laid out on the counter. By the end of the day he had to raise his prices to just above 3/4 of the price of the other produce store, and more than half his stock was gone by the end of the day. He came out with more than 30 times what he had spent on the project boxing up his products as well as locking down the stall. He went back to his apartment for the night. The next morning when he got to his stall, he found several wealthy merchants standing in front of his stall ordering several men in more normal clothes to confiscate the inventory of the stall. Tapping the closest merchant on the shoulder, Naruto asked, "What are you doing?" Annoyed, the merchant turned around and found himself standing in front of the person who had opened the stand and in an arrogant voice said, "Rahul Bhai asked a group confiscating your inventory because you have not yet registered with the village's Merchants Association." "And why do I need to register with the Merchants Association?" Naruto asked as he mentally ran through all the laws that he had found in the village that would apply in his stance case. "Because we are the group that collects and turns in the taxes to the fire daimyo court in the Leaf Village," the somewhat portly man said with the level of arrogance in his voice rising. The longer he spoke, "You do realize that in the village's charter, which was signed by both the first HOK and the Fire Dao, it stated that outside of times of war all taxes from the Leaf Village are supposed to be collected by the Hokage's office and moved on from there, right?" Naruto said as he remembered that was one of the clauses that had never been amended because it eased the amount of work that the Fire Lord's accountants had to go through with his face reading in rage. The merchant said heatedly, "The Merchants Association has been collecting the taxes on merchants' goods and wares for the last 10 years when it was introduced and signed into law." Looking at the man with a fair amount of irritation, Naruto replied, "The village's charter has many clauses and subclauses, but near the beginning of the document it has an absolute in it, in that to change any on the things that it affects in the village's law system you have to have both the current Hokage and the Fire Daio's signature on the bill that changes it, otherwise it is considered as treason." The merchant's face ped some as he said, "Be that as it may, the current system is to pay the Merchants Association, then we send the taxes on for a new drop to the street from the rooftops, with one of them carrying a man that Naruto recognized as one of the accountants from the Hokage's tower." Setting the accountant down, the Anu moved to guard the stall, taking a minute to catch his breath because he wasn't used to getting rides from the Anu, and as soon as his breathing calmed down, the accountant said while pointing at Naruto's transformed form, "You're Shin Natsumi." "Yes," Naruto said while wondering what was going on. There shouldn't have been anything that an accountant from the tower wanted from him, right? Smiling, the accountant said, "Then I have to thank you for correctly bringing your profit margin to us yesterday evening." "Why?" Naruto asked as he tried to figure out why he was being thanked for following the laws that related to a business like the one that he was running. "When you brought in your profit margin yesterday and mentioned to the accountant that you turned it in, and just why you were turning it in, it started a massive check on the law that governed the business in the Leaf Village," the accountant said with a slight smile on his face. "You see, when the fourth Hokage was invested into office, there was still a year until the Third Great Shinobi War ended. Because he was used to the wartime setup, he never questioned the setup, never changing. The Merchants Association was established to help keep the economy going during the wartime setup, and as soon as the war was over, the Hokage's office was supposed to take those duties back over. However, because he didn't know about that, the fourth never changed control of the Merchants Consortium back to where it was supposed to be, and when the taxes returned to the normal setup, the Merchants Association, which by the way is a loose group of the most influential merchants in the Leaf Village, kept collecting the taxes from the Merchants Consortium, which every merchant, as long as they are selling something in the Leaf Village as a member. However, exactly 1/4 of those funds are supposed to go to the village's funds to keep the village in good repairs, as well as to help pay the shinobi who perform border Control preposterous, the member of the Merchants Association said as he began to puff up in anger. Those laws were changed by the council over 15 years ago. You're wrong. Naruto's eyes widened as he realized exactly what had happened to the laws in question. Those laws are part of an amendment to the village charter, and to change them you need both the signature of both the HOK as well as the Dao. Exactly, the accountant from the tower said as his smile widened noticeably. At this very moment every single member of the Merchants Association is being rounded up along with all of the former members who are still alive. Another Anu dropped to the street and said in a low voice to the accountant, other than the one in front of you, every member of the Merchants Association is in custody. Ah, good, go ahead and take him into custody as well. And after I make sure that Shin here is running his business correctly, I'll meet you back at the tower, the accountant said as one of the Anu moved to comply with his orders. The next couple hours saw the accountant going over the fake books with Naruto and telling him how wasteful his business plan had been, along with where he spent well over what he should have. Naruto, having deliberately gone for that impression when he was making the book yesterday, had smiled at him and told him that right now he wasn't sure how long he would be running his business. However, right now he was just making sure that his business plan was able to work before he tried to make more profit. After the accountant left, Naruto looked over the true amount of profit that he had made the day before and wondered how long it would take him to build up the funds for what he was planning. Hyson was glaring at the small amount of paperwork that he still had left to complete and wondered for the 10th time that hour if he would be able to get away with destroying it. It had been a hectic week since a new businessman had followed the correct procedures and had turned in his profit expense report. None of the accountants knew just why he had turned it into them until they heard him mutter annoying legal obligations. During peacetime, the accountants had stumbled around and all over the laws of the village until they had hit on the main reason for why he had turned in his expense report to them. From there it had been kicked up at his office and he had had to order a whole investigation on what had been going on, as it had turned out when Minato had been installed as the 4th Hokage during the last year of the Third Great Ninja War. He had gone over and gotten used to running the village during its economic wartime setting, when a portion of the village's activities that are normally under the Ninja Council are given over to the Civilian Council and whomever they appoint to keep them running. After it was decided that the 4th HOK had never changed the sections of the village back to ninja control, it sparked a search into just what laws and regulations had been sidestepped because they had never been changed from a wartime footing. Needless to say, a lot of economic upheaval was occurring in the village due to the rapid series of events that had occurred in the last week. On his little free time in the office in the last week, Hiran had spied on Naruto several times and had been shocked to learn that the merchant that had started the whole mess had been Naruto in the first place. Spying on him had reveled that he had figured out how to make a true transformation technique, as well as a great many others, with the help of shadow clones sneaking into his apartment and reading through several of his scrolls. Hen had been surprised at some of the innovations that he had figured out in his quest to invent new jutsu. His accidental discovery of how to perform the shadow clone jutsu bothered him a bit, but on the whole it could defiantly be written off when he had seen the notation that had said that currently he could make over 800 clones last for a while when he was at full power. Considering the fact that the seal on his desk hadn't activated, it meant that he had done that on just his own chakra reserves. The seal was set to activate if Naruto had more than a certain amount of demonic chakra in his chakra system. The amount was set to roughly double what he had sitting in his system all the time. Normally in his youth, Horizon could make roughly 50 shadow clones that would last about 8 hours if they weren't doing anything chakra intense, but Nar could make at least 200 last that long while using chakra the whole time. With Naruto's normal chakra reserves being that massive at his current age, it would be impressive to see him in several years when he managed to learn several of the more flashy jutsu. It also explained his horrible chakra control, considering how much time he and his clones spent on maintaining and building his control for only small gains in control from each one. If Naruto decided to go on another one of his summer camping trips, then he would make sure that he got another few chakra control exercises to help with his control. Hopefully some Chunin to Chunin exercises would help with his control, and maybe work out some more techniques. Seeing how he had obtained his stock had been a revelation, and he had had to have Tenzo make sure he wasn't seeing what he thought he saw. What he saw Naruto doing looked so much like the Wood-style bloodline that for almost 24 hours he had thought that Naruto might have the bloodline until he had Tenzo verify it. What Naruto had done was similar to what the ninja in the land of snow did with the ice style. The snow ninja manipulated ice that already existed, while the ice style bloodline allowed its users to form ice out of nearby water. In Naruto's case, the plants he was growing were already there in seed form, and he was just speeding up their growth rate with his chakra, as opposed to growing plants from nothing with the wood bloodline. The 2 months that Naruto had rented the stall for had come to a close, much to Naruto's relief and to the disappointment of many of the Leaf Village's more normal residents. While it had been open, it had kept a steady stock of ingredients that were much cheaper than the other store that also carried them. While none of the things that Naruto had stocked were rare in the Leaf Village, they were normally seasonal items that only came in once or twice a year. The other store that carried them year-round was located in the northern section of the village and catered to the more wealthy clients that could afford the costs of the storing of the ingredients, because Naruto was essentially creating his stock when he ran low with his plant growth technique. He didn't have to worry so much about storing the items until they were bought. Like the other store did, Naruto also, when he located his stall in the eastern market of the village, wound up catering to the more middle-income members of the village, and while he still charged about a quarter of the price more than when the ingredients were in season and flooding the markets, he was still charging much less than the other store did. At the best of times, Naruto's stock at his stall was sold out so fast that he had to refill almost all of his stock every night, and even then he had run out of some things every day. He had made so much profit from the stall that he was checking into buying a property in the eastern market more permanently. His profit margin was high enough that he could buy the property outright and even afford to pay someone to run the shop full-time without it cutting into his training time like it had been for the last 2 months. He had made a huge amounts of pure profit, but it had severely cut into the time that he could train most of the school days that there wasn't sparring. He would send in a shadow clone into the academy, and on the days that there was sparring he would have a shadow clone mind the stall, but he was always very nervous about having a shadow clone manage the stall, because there had been a fair number of times that the shadow clone had nearly popped while it had been minding the stall and had to pull out another crate from that day's inventory. With an actual shop of his own, he would be able to hire in someone else to take care of the shop and just have to deliver inventory as needed. After Naruto took 2 days off of his self-training after his stall finished doing business, he started back to training himself and was making a fair bit of progress. While he had only had his shadow clones working on creating and modifying techniques and seals, he had also been writing down ideas for him to practice when his stall shut down. It took another month before Naruto was able to purchase a small shop in the eastern market of the village and get the paperwork filled out for his ownership, as well as be issued the necessary permits to run his shop. Now that he had a more stable location of business after the purchase of the shop, he still had more than 3 hours of the profits from the first 2 months and decided to look around the village for other things that he could buy. To his shock, he found that his apartment complex was on the market for much less than he would have thought because of its size. In fact, as he checked, there were almost half of the buildings in the same neighborhood as his apartment building on the market for significantly less than the buildings in other parts of the village. Buying 4 of the buildings in the same neighborhood of his apartment complex along with his apartment complex knocked him down to a fourth of what he started with, but as he no longer needed to pay rent, he figured that it should even out eventually. The other 4 buildings that he bought consisted of 2 more apartment complexes, 1 bar that had gone out of business, and 1 larger family house. Naruto had wanted to buy more buildings, but felt that he should wait until he had built up more funds first, as he needed to keep on top of the utilities for the buildings that he now owned, routing all of the mail and rent payments to the now empty manager's room in the building that Naruto had his apartment in. Was rather easy for some reason that Naruto couldn't figure out, but he wasn't going to question a good thing. Most of the general repairs that he was now responsible for in the buildings was now done by shadow clones at night after he had transformed them into other forms. His true transformation jutsu now had 5 base forms that he could modify on the fly with different hair and eye colors, along with him affecting different strides and mannerisms, allowed him to keep his clones inconspicuous. Hizen could only stare in shock as Tenzo, or Tiger as his Ambu code name was, gave him the report on just what Naruto had been up to over the last 2 months, since he had caused a major upheaval in the economy of the Leaf Village. If the amount of profits that Tenzo was reporting were true, then Naruto had made almost as much as 5 S-class missions paid out in a month. When most ninja that could take S-class missions only took 1 or 2 a year because of the mental and death toll. Aspects of the missions. Hearing just what Naruto had bought with his money had him laughing at the sheer impossibility of what the former owners of the buildings had done. They hadn't wanted to own buildings in the same area that Naruto lived and had put up the buildings at lower than market values just so that they could buy buildings in other parts of the village to set up their businesses again without the stigma of being near Nar's apartment. The ironic thing was that they had sold the buildings to Nar in the first place, although just what Naro was going to do with a rundown bar, 3 apartment complexes and 1 medium-sized family home was truly the question. And if what Tenzo had heard was correct, then Naruto planned on buying more buildings in the village. On the other hand, with Naruto buying those buildings and keeping them well maintained and kept the paperwork on them up, then it would at least take a small cut into the amount of paperwork that crossed his desk every day. More than half of the paperwork that crossed his desk was incorrectly filled out reports that needed his signature to have the offender issued a warning that they need to redo parts of their paperwork. Besides, maybe with these businesses on his hands he wouldn't cause any more trouble like he had 2 months ago. More than half of the Merchants Association had been stripped of their possessions entirely, while the other half had had to pay of huge debts to the village coffers because of the stolen and misappropriated funds. In fact, the Tao had been very displeased with the merchants that had been in charge of the association when the Third Shinobi War had ended and had ordered their deaths as an example to any others who had thought that stealing from him and the funds that he chose to supply the Leaf Village with one of the younger villagers that didn't glare at him every time that he saw him to run the shop that Naruto had purchased was almost ridiculously easy. All that he had to do was find out what his job at the time had paid and give him just a little bit more each paycheck. His previous job had been stocking shelves at one of the larger stores that specialized in having just about everything available but mostly carried things that everyone needed consistently. With Naruto's shop, it only carried various produce, and the only stocking that he had to do was pull empty crates off of an area and move them to the back room and open another of the crates in the area, as Naruto had his shadow clones do the restocking every night, and the villager only had to move empty crates to the back room. The villager thought that he was getting a much better end of the deal, as Naruto only had to assign a dozen shadow clones to restock the shop every night and another dozen every week or so to every apartment building. His schedule opened up immensely. He had been able to get in a huge amount of training in comparison to the 2 months that he had run his business himself. His profits weren't coming in nearly as fast as they had been, but considering that he actually had a person other than himself on his payroll, did take up some of his profit, but not nearly so much as he would have thought. Part of the training that he was working on was modifying the basic wind chakra exercise that he had found to learn how to carve good furniture in his attempt to refurnish the bar that he had bought. It had been closed after a bar fight between 3 Johan, and the owner couldn't pay to have the building and furniture fixed. Next, the previous owner had sold off all of the alcohol that he had left in stock and used the funds to repair the building and then sold it. Naruto had in fact been lucky to purchase it when he had, because with it mostly fixed, then another bar owner could move in and open up a second location or have a backup location in case their bars suffered similar damages. Most bars in the Leaf Village has layers of durability seals on almost everything in their establishments and didn't have much to worry about in the damage department, but a fair number that dealt almost exclusively with the civilian population like the one that Naruto now owned didn't take that precaution. It took him 2 weeks to figure out how to carve furniture with wind chakra, and even then most of it wound up being reduced to kindling because of how bad he was at carving. Over the next 2 months his carving skills got good enough that when he actually opened the bar he could just say that he bought cheaper furniture because of how the last owner had gone out of business. His research clones had also been going through the library searching for information on how alcohol was made. While he got some basic ways to make different types of alcohol, they were really basic and didn't have anywhere close to the taste that the bottles that he had purchased. To compare them to, part of that he guessed was because of the fact that the bottles that he had made hadn't been aged, but he was working on that with one of his sealing failures. The failure that he was working on had caused most of his clones to age themselves out of existence within a second, and when used on a piece of metal in water had caused it to rust out of existence within a minute. So far he had been working on making the aging effect far less pronounced, but he had thought that it might be useful in its unaltered form against ninja when he became one, so it wasn't on his failure list except in that it wasn't even close to what he had been trying to make. Right now he didn't really have any way to make the seal stop except by running out of energy, and even with the least amount that he fed the seal it still would run about a half an hour, which was admittedly better than the hour and a half it had started at. In the end it took another month for him to figure out how to set up the seal to age the sake appropriately for sale without aging the bottle into dust. Still, some of the sake that he had made was extremely potent, while his later experiments were much less potent because of his research into what the other bars served. He had also looked into cooking some basic meals to go with the alcohol that he had made. He had also started looking into other types of alcohol that he could try and make, and had begun experimenting with various fruits and berries that he could get his hands on, as he could make over 1,000 clones last about 8 hours. Now he had plenty of clones that were free to experiment on whatever they liked. This led to about 500 of his clones working on his ninja training, and the other 500 working on other things that interested him, with about 300 learning as much as they could about alcohol from experimenting with it. It led to some truly bizarre memories from the clones that had tested each type. When they made the alcohol, they made at least 4 bottles of each type and stored them in the 4 basement floors under the bar that he had bought. There had only been 2, but when he had turned in the paperwork to get permits to build 2 more floors below, it had been approved much faster than he had thought it would be, keeping the recipes to the alcohols that he had made in one of his spare larger scrolls. Also made sure that they were hard to duplicate. Storing the bottles by number was also a way that he kept them separated. The kinds that his tester clones liked had several dozen bottles made, while he never made more than the 3 extra bottles of the ones that he didn't like. He figured that once he opened his bar, then he could always make more of the ones that he didn't like if anyone who came in to buy them liked them. There were many different types of basic techniques that weren't truly a secret when making alcohol, so the clones that were making it would have things to experiment with. For quite a while he also had to learn how to make the bottles for the alcohol that he was making, and just like the furniture had been, he managed to get the bottles looking like they had been made by someone learning how to make bottles. The barrels of various size and wood also took time to make, but considering that he actually had a ton of clones that were working on learning how to make them, it went much faster than any would suspect. The remainder of the academy year went just as the previous one had, and again Naruto, with the information in the altered books that he had bought, just barely managed to pass. Unlike the previous year, however, this year actually had a high level demonstration that he could attempt to figure out and learn how to perform. The previous year had Amasuru Toy demonstrating his wind manipulation and cutting a target in half from almost 10 yards away when he channeled a tremendous amount of wind chakra into his chakra blades. Because of the fact that it was just basic manipulation taken to an extreme level, Naruto could learn it, but it would take some time to figure out, along with the fact that he couldn't use it without a blade that could channel his chakra, so he couldn't really learn the previous year's example. Because chakra blades were extremely expensive, as the materials that were used to make a good one had to be gathered from all across the elemental nations, and the different shinobi villages guarded their resources that made up the chakra metals extremely well. There was some trading that went on because of the fact that most of the villages wanted some of the materials that weren't native to their area, but each material was extremely expensive. On a related note, some clans across the elemental nations had come up with ways around using the expensive chakra metals. 3 of the 7 swordsmen of the Mist Village used swords that had been made by these clans. The sword that Zabuza Mochi used was one of these substitutions, and while it worked well in its setup, it still wasn't even half as good as a similar sword made entirely of chakra metal would have been. This year's demonstration, on the other hand, had been given by the Hokage himself, and he had shown off his Earth-style Great Mud Wall. The demonstration had also included 2 Chunin and a Jan using the same jutsu, just to show the differences between their mastery of the jutsu. The first 4 hand seals Naruto recognized because they were one of the failures that he hadn't been able to make anything out of yet. Seeing the hand seals for the old mud wall made it clear that he had been at once very close and very far from completing the technique. Just seeing 4 people use the same common defensive technique was somewhat enlightening, as it showed just how different their mastery of it was, along with the difference in their chakra reserves. The 2 Chunin made walls that were about 6 feet tall and about 4 feet wide, while the Jan made a wall nearly twice that size. Here Ison made a wall that was over 30 feet tall and 20 feet wide. The difference is in their use of the jutsu might have also had something to do with the size that they made the wall. Because they were showing off the size of the most commonly made the wall when they used it spying on Naruto's training. Had given Hizen the idea to do the demonstration at the academy this year because he hadn't given a display of any of the jutsu that he had mastered in over 10 years. He had seen Naruto use the water dragon that Kakashi had demonstrated 2 years ago, but he had seen the frustration that seemed to come from the clones that were practicing it, knowing that one of his Jon and 2 of his Chunin who knew the jutsu were free. On the demonstration day he had asked them to help with the demonstration by showing the differences in the walls that they made. He hoped that by seeing that the same jutsu acting differently in the hands of different shinobi, then Naruto would figure out just why his water dragon was so much different than Kakashi's. His spying on Naruto's recent exploits also had him ordering Bor to get some of the bottles of sake that Naruto had made in bulk, and he had been surprised that it actually passed the poison tests that he had put it under. It actually was sake that was really potent. When Naruto actually opened his bar, Hin was going to have to start getting his stash from there, even if it was extremely potent. One of the bottles that Bor had stolen from one of the earlier batches was potent enough that 2 small shot glasses and he, the Hokage, was out like a light. He knew that if Tsunade had tried it, then she could have finished about 6 glasses of the stuff because of her genetics and her medical training. It was perfect for a nightcap. However, Hizen was glad that the economy had settled down now that all of the correct laws were being followed by the merchants of the Leaf Village. He was also thankful that most of the other wartime measures had been returned to normal before he had taken back over, and that the few that hadn't had actually worked out well enough that the Tao had decided not to punish those involved so long as they were more accountable and kept up the good work that they had been doing. Danzo was known as the War Hawk, and in truth he wouldn't deny the description that most applied to him. He had lived through the same 2 wars that Hin had, and he had for a long time considered himself a rival of Hin. Just after the Kaiui had attacked, he had tried to get the right to train Naruto to call upon the fearsome power that had been sealed within him and been denied. He had later realized that it may have been for the best, as while he though that he knew how the seal would react to his plans for training Naruto, he didn't know for sure, and he could have released the Kaui by accident in his attempt to get Naruto to control its power. He had been thly disappointed in Naruto's performance in the academy until one of the spies that kept an eye on Naruto saw just how much the academy teachers were hindering his learning. He had just decided that if it continued, then he would have one of his agents that was part of the normal ninja forces give Naruto some tutoring during the academy breaks. When his spies had heard Naruto's declaration toward the end of his first year in the academy, after he had heard that report, he had decided to wait a year to see just what Naruto would do with his declaration, and had been shocked at how far he had come. Knowing about how many shadow clones Naruto could make also stopped him from interfering, because right now he was working on making himself a powerful ninja, and already he had made techniques that Danzo would have, though impossible with his shadow clones. If Danzo felt the need, then he could always assign enough of his agents to sets of Naruto's clones to make up for any lack in his shinobi education. One of the worst things that those who knew Danzo thought about him was that he suppressed all emotion in his agents. While this was mostly true, he had also specially trained some of his forces and hadn't put them through the training to suppress their emotions. Danzo knew better than anyone that something he hadn't foreseen could end his life easily, and that if that were to occur, then all of the effort that he put forth in his plans could come to naught. The few agents that he put through his training that didn't have their emotions suppressed were his backup plan in case something happened to him. He hadn't even planned for Naruto to become anything like his agents, because he had hoped to groom him into becoming a Hokage that both he had hears and could have been proud of. At this point, though, he was relatively happy that his plans for Naruto fell through after all. While he wasn't the powerhouse that he would have been under Danzo's tutelage, he had created a huge number of techniques that could help the village down the line, and later when he unsealed his parents' cottage where most of their scrolls were, he would undoubtedly become a force to be reckoned with. While he would have liked to have cut in when Naruto began buying up and running businesses, he held his peace, because while unorthodox, it was good training for when he became a shinobi. Besides, he was developing ninja skills when he was setting up the businesses. Using the cutting nature of wind chakra to carve furniture was ridiculous, because it is almost impossible to control the wind blades that well, but somehow Naruto had managed it, and he only knew the leaf cutting Exercise that helped train shinobi in the controlling of the wind element. Naruto didn't know any of the more advanced exercises that would have increased his control over wind chakra to where it wouldn't have been preposterous. On another note, Hen hadn't been the only one to get samples from the larger groupings of sake that Naruto had made in his hin. Had Danzo had determined that the stuff was perfect for when he couldn't push the memories of all the blood that he had spilled in his day out of his mind so that he could sleep, laying in a rather large stock of inventory for the store and moving it there was the first thing that Naruto worked on when it came closer end of his third year at the academy. Because he would only be bringing more stock every 2 weeks, he had already informed his employee that he would be making a bit of a trip to set up contracts with his suppliers and that he would arrange for more inventory every other week. In truth, he would just come into the village every other week bringing in more inventory for the store with him. He would also do the general repairs on the apartment complexes when he was in the village. He thanked himself for having the foresight to wait to open the bar until after the break as he practiced cooking and filled out his stock so that he would have an appropriate amount of diversity in his inventory. So far on his experimental types of alcohol, he had only had to throw out 5 different types because they were poisonous. The second thing he had done was to tell the Hokage that he wanted to go camping again this year about a week ahead of time. The HOK gave Naruto several scrolls that he thought would be useful to his training, with the comment that several of them were more chakra control exercises this year. He was told that he would get to use training ground number 75 as his camping spot. Training ground 75 was rarely used because it was designed to be a place where high-level earth and water jutsu could be taught or learned without doing much damage to the environment. A little over half of the training ground was taken up by a fair-sized rock quarry and a good-sized lake, which was why so little damage was done to the surroundings. The trick was to aim the water jutsu toward the lake while aiming the earth jutsu into one of the walls on the quarry. Naruto already had a whole list of things that he wanted to accomplish on this summer training trip, and while he wasn't sure on where to start, he didn't know that by the time that he got back the large scroll that was covered in storage seals would be full of alcohol by the time that he got back, thinking that it would probably help in almost all the other areas of his training. Naruto started his training with chakra control with a huge number of clones assisting him. Another group of clones continued to experiment with cooking and making alcohol. The first 2 weeks passed fairly quickly, and by the end of them he could hold 7 different rocks on his body with just his chakra. He was having problems moving them, but he was defiantly better than when he had started and accidentally caused a rock to crack from the force of his chakra. He had also tried using chakra to walk up a tree, and while he was sure that it was possible, he hadn't gotten it quite yet. He wasn't quite sure about other people trying his cooking yet, but to him it tasted miles better than it had been. His alcohol had gotten more of the experiments that he wanted to get done out of the way, and while some had turned out well, others had turned out just plain nasty. His quick trip into the village to reload the inventory of his produce store was the longest section of his trip, as he and his clones refilled the stock of the store, dropping off a dozen clones to clean the apartment buildings was also relatively easy. The next 2 weeks followed similarly, except that he finally pulled out the scrolls that the Hokage had given him this year. Seeing the tree walking exercise in one of the chakra control exercise scrolls was rather funny because he had already been trying to accomplish it. The other dozen exercises were all rather strange compared to the exercises that he had been given the previous year, but as he though about it, some of them did seem to make more sense back when he had been practicing the elemental chakra starter exercises. They hadn't made much sense either. All of the exercises made sense now, but rarely had they made sense before he had done them, and even then he usually had to have a fair amount of clones practicing the exercises with him, considering the number of clones that he could make and last for over 8 hours now. While they were practicing with chakra, he would soon need more things to occupy his time, even with his soon-to-be-opened bar, also considering that he managed to make a couple dozen jutsu at least from each hobby that he had taken up so far. It would probably end up helping his shinobi carrier along later when he got into the village for his visit. On the second week, he was shocked to see that his shop had a sign that said that it was closed as the owner was out setting up new stock. Getting into the shop was easy, and looking through the books revealed reason that the shop was closed easily about 3 days after he had refilled the stockroom in the shop last time one of the Akamichi had come in, and after taking a quick look around and bought samples of several of the items available the next day, he along with several of his clansmen had come to the shop and cleared out the shop of ingredients. The entry in the books also said that the Akamichi had said that they would be back in 4 to 5 weeks if the ingredients maintained their quality. Throughout the whole batch, sending out some clones to arrange for extra to be brought into the shop, Naruto wondered if it would help if Thea came back. Fortunately, everything else that he was doing in the village was going well, and he was finished in about 2 hours, longer than he had been in the village the previous week, with half of his summer break gone in a little less than 4 weeks until the next year at the academy began. He was hoping to finish with all the chakra control exercises that he had been given by the Hokage. Already his control was well ahead of where it had been, but he was still having trouble with it. The seal that had been in his books took almost a minute to burn out. Now where it had burned out almost instantly before, one of his clones that had been researching seals also managed to make a more sturdy version that burned off extra chakra by